You feel it before you see it, a heaviness in the atmosphere, a tension that doesn't make sense. Things start to break down without reason. Relationships strain. Finances dry up, prayers feel delayed, peace is stolen, and yet nothing on the surface explains it. That's because the real battle isn't happening in the natural, it's raging in the unseen. There is a realm that eyes cannot see, but spirits can feel. A war that doesn't make the news, but determines outcomes on earth. Behind every strange delay, every unexplainable failure, every cycle that keeps repeating, there is a hand at work, a hand not of flesh and blood, but of darkness. This is the battleground of spiritual warfare. This is the territory of evil plans, demonic conspiracies, and satanic interruptions. But this is also the realm where fire prayer wins. Ephesians 6:12 says it plainly, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Your enemy is not your co-worker. It's not your ex. It's not the person who betrayed you. The real enemy hides in shadows, manipulates moments, and launches invisible arrows in broad daylight. You must understand this. What happens in the physical is often just a reflection of what's already been stirred in the spirit. And if you fight spiritual battles with natural weapons, you will always lose. Arguments won't fix it. Money won't shift it. Time won't heal it. Only one thing will break through: fire-saturated, authority-filled, spirit-led prayer. Because while the enemy is forming evil plans, God is waiting for someone to speak fire. Not soft words, not empty religious routines, but warfare prayer. The kind that disrupts hell and dismantles demonic altars. The kind of prayer that shakes foundations and calls down fire from heaven. Elijah prayed like that. Daniel prayed like that. Jesus prayed like that. And you were born to pray like that. The reason some people stay bound for years is not because the enemy is stronger. It's because the enemy is unchallenged. Darkness only dominates where light is silent, but when you open your mouth with fire, the realm of darkness trembles. When you begin to pray not as a beggar, but as a warrior, chains break, delays are canceled, evil plans are overturned. This is not the season to be passive. This is not the time to be casual with your prayer life. The enemy has declared war. You cannot afford to whisper when demons are screaming. You were not called to survive the storm. You were anointed to silence it. And it begins when you understand the battle is unseen, but the victory is real, and it belongs to those who pray with fire. Not every setback is random. Not every delay is coincidence. There are moments when everything around you seems calm, yet your spirit is under siege. You feel pressure with no visible source, resistance without a clear reason. What you're sensing is not confusion. It's a conspiracy, because the enemy does not strike without strategy. Satan doesn't attack blindly. He plots in darkness, schemes in silence, and hides his traps beneath familiar faces and ordinary moments. There are secret meetings happening in the spirit realm, conversations you were never invited to, but you were always the target of. Demonic councils gather to design destruction. Evil altars are raised to block progress. Whispered curses are sent out like arrows, timed perfectly to collide with your next breakthrough. The enemy studies patterns, watches weaknesses, and waits until the moment is just right. Then he launches the attack, not to hurt you temporarily, but to derail you permanently. He'll use people you trust, people you admire, people who smile to your face and speak poison behind your back. He'll manipulate timing, sending distractions just before destiny, launching delays right before elevation. He'll wrap traps in opportunity, package curses in relationships and mask warfare as inconvenience. Because if he can't destroy you with force, he'll destroy you with deception. But here's the truth the devil hopes you never discover. God sees in the dark. God hears the whispers. God knows the secret plots before they are spoken. And while the enemy is busy crafting weapons in the shadows, heaven is already preparing your defense. What the enemy does in secret, God will expose in power. What the enemy tries to hide, God will bring to light. That's why prayer is not optional. It's your early warning system. Prayer is where you receive divine intelligence. It's where God reveals what the enemy hoped you'd never discern, the trap you didn't see, he shows you, the betrayal you didn't suspect, he warns you, the delay that was planned, he cancels it in advance. When you walk with God, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. Not because weapons aren't formed, they are, but because God intercepts every arrow, confuses every plan, and sets fire to every altar not built by his hands. The enemy plots in darkness, but the fire of prayer brings light. And when light enters, darkness has no hiding place. So don't be afraid. When opposition rises, don't panic when things don't make sense. Recognize the pattern, discern the moment, and most of all, ignite the fire, because what was plotted in the night will be shattered by the light. What was spoken in secret will be silenced by the Spirit. And every snare the enemy set for your fall, God will use it for your elevation. A man I know used to pray like most people do, soft, uncertain, filled with doubt and desperation. Quiet requests, whispered pleas, hoping maybe God was listening. But nothing changed. The oppression remained. The attacks didn't stop. The dreams were still tormented. The doors stayed shut. Until one day the frustration became fuel. He realized this wasn't a moment to cry, it was a moment to war. Prayer is not a suggestion. It's not a spiritual hobby. It's not something we do to feel religious. Prayer is a weapon, a sword in the hands of the righteous, a hammer that breaks strongholds. It's divine artillery forged in heaven, designed to destroy every assignment of hell. And once he understood that, he stopped praying like a victim and started praying like a soldier. Something shifted. He began to rise at midnight, not to complain, but to command. He didn't just ask for peace. He declared war against every spirit of torment. He didn't just ask for open doors. He shattered demonic gates in prayer. His language changed. His posture changed. He was no longer hoping. He was enforcing. Because fire prayer is not about volume. It's about authority. It's not about emotion. It's about execution. You don't beg with fire. You bind, you loose, you declare, you tear down. The enemy trembles when a believer discovers the true nature of prayer because he doesn't mind quiet religion. He's not intimidated by routine prayers or memorized words. But when fire comes out of your mouth, when the Spirit ignites your words with power, demonic blueprints begin to burn. The plans that were written to destroy you begin to unravel. The curses break, the attacks stop, the storm ceases. You don't need to be eloquent, you don't need to be loud, you need to be aligned. Fire prayer is birthed from revelation. When you realize who you are and who you serve, your words carry weight. You're not speaking to impress heaven. You're speaking to shake hell. You're not trying to get God's attention. You're using the authority He already gave you. The believer who once begged is now a builder, a destroyer of evil structures, a breaker of chains. Every night he stands in the gap, and the spirit realm feels the impact. Witches lose sleep, demons lose ground, and the plans formed in secret begin to fall apart. That's what happens when you stop praying out of fear and start praying out of fire. You stop reacting and start reigning. Prayer is not your last resort, it's your first strike. And the moment you see it as a weapon, the enemy sees you as a threat. The moment his knees hit the floor, something in heaven responded. He wasn't praying out of routine. This wasn't a religious obligation. This was warfare. His spirit was stirred, his mouth full of fire, and his heart anchored in faith. And as he opened his mouth to pray, something unseen shifted. Because when a believer prays with fire, heaven doesn't stay silent. God is not deaf to desperation, but he responds to faith. He doesn't move because of noise. He moves because of authority. And when fire prayer's lifted, the throne room of heaven becomes a war room. Angels are dispatched, assignments are activated, instructions are issued, divine reinforcements are released on command. While some people sleep, others rise and shake realms. He didn't see the angels, but they were there, standing by, armed and ready, waiting for a voice that matched heaven's will. Fire prayer is not just heard, it's backed. When earth speaks what heaven authored, the supernatural responds. Gabriel didn't delay when Daniel prayed. Michael didn't hesitate when war broke out. Heaven moves at the sound of alignment. That's why the enemy fights your prayer life more than anything else. Because he knows that every fire prayer sends orders into the Spirit. Every decree cancels his plans. Every declaration burns his maps. When a believer prays with fire, demonic altars tremble, strongholds begin to crack, chains lose their grip, because no satanic plan can stand when heaven stands behind your words. He prayed and didn't see results immediately, but something inside told him, keep going, because fire doesn't just burn instantly, it consumes consistently. With every prayer, he was weakening the foundation of the enemy's camp. With every midnight cry, angels were striking targets, intercepting curses, rerouting attacks. He was not alone. He never had been. But now he was aware. His prayers were weapons. His voice was a trigger. Heaven had been waiting on him to speak. The enemy whispers, "You're wasting time." But God says, "You're moving mountains." The enemy says, nothing's happening, but heaven says everything is shifting. Fire prayer isn't always followed by fireworks, but it's always followed by impact. The spiritual realm bends to the voice of the faithful. So when you pray, don't hold back. Don't wonder if you're being heard. You are. The moment you align with heaven's will, you command heaven's armies. The moment you lift a fire prayer, the throne room leans in, demons scatter, angels descend, and God, the Lord of hosts, begins to fight battles you didn't even know were being fought. When you pray, heaven doesn't wait. When you pray with fire, heaven moves. Midnight is not just a time, it's a realm, a spiritual threshold where dimensions shift and the veil between heaven and hell thins. While the world sleeps, both heaven and hell are wide awake. Battles are fought, decisions are made, evil altars are activated. But for the believer who understands the weight of this hour, midnight is not for rest, it's for fire. He used to sleep through it, tossing and turning while his spirit wrestled unseen battles, dreams laced with fear, sudden anxiety at 3 a.m., heavy weights that had no name. He thought it was just restlessness until he woke up one night and prayed, not softly, not casually. He prayed like someone who realized the night wasn't silent, it was screaming. And something shifted, because the midnight hour is not ordinary. It's the time when spiritual gates open, when covenants are renewed and assignments are released. It was at midnight that the angel of death passed through Egypt and struck every firstborn. It was at midnight that Paul and Silas lifted their voices in chains, and the prison foundation shook. Chains didn't break in the morning, they broke in the dark. Because God moves in power when his people pray in the hours when flesh sleeps but spirits speak. Midnight is when evil altars are busiest, when curses are dispatched, enchantments are spoken, and monitoring spirits roam. But when a fire-breathing believer rises at that hour, the script flips. Altars meant to curse begin to crack. Arrows launched in secret return to sender. Rooms shift, atmospheres burn, because darkness cannot hold when light wakes up. He stopped being afraid of the night and started owning it. He didn't pray for comfort. He declared judgment. He didn't pray for peace. He called down power. Every altar speaking against my name catch fire. Every chain forged in darkness break now. And with each declaration, the air grew thick. Heaven leaned in, angels moved, and hell shook. Midnight is not a time to hope. It's a time to war, not a time to whisper, but to roar. While others dream, the watchman intercedes. While witches chant, the child of God releases fire. This is not religion, it's strategy. The most dangerous believer is the one who refuses to sleep through their breakthrough. He didn't have to be loud to be effective. He just had to be present. Midnight became his altar, his battleground, his furnace, and every night he stood in the dark, he became more dangerous, more discerning, more powerful. Because when the believer rises at midnight, they don't just pray, they ignite. They don't just speak, they strike. Chains break, curses crumble, and evil plans burn before they ever reach the light of day. Midnight is no longer the enemy's hour. It belongs to those who carry fire. He prayed for the pain to stop, but it only paused. He fasted for a breakthrough, but the same cycle kept returning. Doors would open only to slam shut. Progress would come only to be reversed. It felt like running in circles, tired, frustrated, and confused, until one day the Spirit whispered, "You're attacking the fruit, but the root is still alive." Most believers wage war on symptoms. They rebuke what they can see, not realizing the real enemy is buried deep in the foundation. That sickness, it didn't start last month. That poverty, it's older than your bank account. That fear, that shame, that rejection, it's been passed down like inheritance. Evil foundations don't just appear, they are built brick by brick over time through sin, trauma, bloodlines, and demonic access points. And as long as the foundation stands, the fruit will keep growing. But fire prayer is different. It doesn't stop at what's visible. It goes underground. It doesn't just silence voices. It destroys thrones. Fire prayer is violent. It's targeted. It is divine demolition. It tears up every lie, curse, altar, and legal right that hell has been hiding behind. And when that fire falls, no foundation can survive. He began to pray differently, no longer asking for temporary relief. He cried out for permanent destruction. "Lord, send your fire into my bloodline. Burn every altar erected in my name. Expose and destroy every ancestral covenant speaking against my life." He didn't whisper, he roared. He didn't ask, he commanded, and heaven backed him. In the spirit, it looked like an earthquake. Altars cracked, chains snapped, ancient doors that had been shut for generations burst open, because the fire of God doesn't play fair. It doesn't leave anything standing that wasn't built by Him. Ancestral curses broke. Agreements with darkness were canceled. Demonic contracts burned. Soul ties dissolved like wax in a furnace. What counseling couldn't touch, fire consumed in seconds, because fire prayer doesn't require years. It requires intensity. It requires revelation. It requires a heart that says, enough is enough. The enemy had built a network, layers of bondage, deeply rooted patterns, hidden traps, but all of it began to scatter. Demons that had occupied space for decades fled without resistance, not because he shouted louder, but because the fire was real. And real fire doesn't just chase away darkness, it changes the atmosphere forever. Many are stuck because they've settled for trimming leaves when God is calling them to uproot trees. But the moment you pray with fire, the ground trembles, the invisible starts shaking, and everything that's been silently sabotaging your life begins to collapse. If the foundation isn't holy, it must burn. If the covenant isn't divine, it must break. Fire prayer makes no deals. It issues judgment. And when it's prayed from a heart full of faith, every evil foundation must fall. Not tomorrow, not eventually. Now. Hell is not afraid of routine. Demons don't panic over religious repetition. But the moment a believer releases fire, the atmosphere shifts. The enemy knows that fire is not just heat, it's judgment. Fire is God's signature on warfare. It's the weapon that heaven uses to answer every altar built by darkness. And when fire prayer is released, hell goes into chaos. You don't see it with your eyes, but in the spirit realm, demons scatter, orders are canceled, assignments are aborted. Confusion spreads like wildfire through the ranks of the enemy. Panic erupts in the camp of darkness because fire prayer doesn't just speak. It strikes. It doesn't just rise. It invades. It penetrates every layer of secrecy, exposing what was hidden and uprooting what was planted in the dark. He didn't know what was behind the resistance. He only knew something was always working against him. Promotions would vanish. Relationships would turn. Progress would stall. But one night he got tired of guessing and decided to pray with fire, not just emotional words, but declarations full of holy authority. Let every enemy hiding in plain sight be exposed. Let every monitoring spirit go blind. Let fire consume every altar raised against my destiny. And suddenly things began to surface. People who pretended to be friends revealed themselves. Dreams exposed hidden enemies. Conversations turned. Everything in the dark started coming to the light, not because he investigated, but because fire flushed them out. Because when you pray with fire, exposure becomes inevitable. Demons can't hide in a burning room. The devil hates fire because it reminds him of what's coming. He doesn't fear talent or education. He doesn't fear status or intellect. He fears fire because fire is where he's headed. Eternal flames, unending torment. Every time a believer prays with fire, it's a prophetic announcement of Satan's end. Every fiery declaration is a rehearsal of his defeat. That's why he'll fight your prayer life. That's why he'll make you tired, distracted, silent, because he knows the moment you catch fire, his grip breaks. In the camp of the enemy, fire causes confusion. Demons lose direction. Plans collapse. What was organized becomes disorder. What was coordinated becomes scattered. Because God is not a God of confusion, but he will confuse your enemies when you pray with fire. Pharaoh's army marched in unity until fire hit. Then wheels fell off chariots, directions shifted, judgment descended. The same still happens today. Fire is not emotional hype, it's spiritual heat. It forces the kingdom of darkness into retreat. So when the enemy comes in like a flood, you don't whisper, you don't fold. You lift your voice and release fire. Because fire doesn't negotiate, fire doesn't argue. Fire destroys, and every time you use it, hell remembers its end is near. They told him he wasn't qualified, laid off with no warning, no backup plan, and bills still demanding payment. Friends turned silent. The ones who promised to help vanished. Then came the news from the doctor, a sickness with a name too heavy for his spirit to carry. It felt like everything hit at once, loss, betrayal, fear, and for a moment he almost believed the enemy's lie. You've been defeated. But something inside him refused to die. He didn't have answers, but he had a fire. Not in his circumstances, but in his spirit. He remembered the scripture he had recited 1,000 times before, but this time it wasn't memory, it was revelation. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Not no weapon formed. The weapons will form. The traps will be set. The lies will be told. The arrows will fly, but they won't prosper. The enemy had forged weapons with precision. He formed them in the furnace of generational curses, coated them in betrayal, sharpened them with loss. He aimed them at his mind, his body, his peace. But what the enemy forgot was that no matter how carefully the weapon is designed, it cannot stand against the fire of God. And the moment this believer opened his mouth and declared war in the Spirit, heaven responded. He didn't pray for survival, he prayed for fire. Lord, let your fire fall on every weapon formed against me. Let every lie be consumed. Let every sickness dry up at the root. Let every demonic arrow be turned back sevenfold. And with each word, something invisible began to crumble. The diagnosis didn't disappear immediately, but the fear did. The betrayal still hurt, but the bondage broke. Because fire prayer doesn't always change what you see first. It changes what you carry. Weapons formed in secret places began to malfunction. Evil strategies began to turn on themselves. People who rose up to slander him were silenced without a word. What the enemy meant for evil, God began to twist for good. What was sent to bury him became the soil for his next breakthrough. Because when fire meets a weapon, the weapon loses its edge. The devil is a craftsman. He forms things, but God is a consuming fire. He devours what is formed. You may see the weapon, you may feel the heat of the attack, but don't panic. Fire prayer makes weapons melt. What should have broken you only burns away what doesn't belong. The job loss becomes a new assignment. The betrayal becomes your birthing. The sickness becomes your testimony, because the fire doesn't just protect, it purifies. He walked through the storm, but not alone. He came out of the fire, but not burned, because when a believer prays with fire, even the best forged weapons fall apart in God's presence. Isaiah 54:17 wasn't just a verse, it became his reality. The weapon was real, but it did not win. He didn't know there was an altar speaking against him. He couldn't see it, but he felt the effects, cycles that wouldn't break, blessings that turned to burdens, and doors that closed just before breakthrough. He thought it was bad luck, thought it was coincidence. But in the Spirit, there was an altar raised with his name on it, where sacrifices were made and covenants were enforced, not by God, but by darkness. Evil altars are real. They are places where demonic agreements are sealed and reinforced. They don't need candles or blood in your living room. They can be ancient, buried deep in the bloodline. They can be fueled by curses spoken long ago, oaths made by ancestors, or even sins never repented of. And until that altar is torn down, it will keep speaking. It will keep demanding. It will keep blocking. You don't reason with an altar, you don't counsel it, you don't ignore it and hope it dies quietly. Fire is the only language altars understand, and not just any fire, the fire of the Holy Ghost, the fire that fell on Mount Carmel and turned water-soaked sacrifices into dust. The fire that proves whose God is the real God. He started praying differently, not for comfort, but for confrontation. Let every evil altar raised against my destiny catch fire. Let the blood of Jesus silence every voice calling my name from demonic places. Let the fire of God consume the foundation of every generational bondage. It wasn't poetry, it was power. And the moment those words left his mouth, something shifted. In the unseen, the fire fell. And when fire falls, altars burn. Not just the structure, but the system, the sacrifice, the spirits attached to it, the covenants made through it. Everything is consumed. Fire prayer doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't beg. It judges. It renders evil altars powerless. It silences demonic voices. It dismantles every legal right hell thinks it has. He started seeing things shift. Patterns broke. Delays ended. The heaviness lifted. What had held his family for generations couldn't hold him anymore, because the altar that had fed on their pain was gone, consumed. The covenant was canceled. The chain was broken, all because he stopped praying around the problem and started calling down fire. Altars are spiritual doorways. As long as they stand, demons have access. But when you pray with fire, those doors are sealed shut by the blood, and what was once allowed to operate is now illegal. Fire doesn't leave traces, it destroys evidence. And when God's fire falls, the enemy has nothing left to stand on. Every altar speaking against your life must burn. Every covenant that didn't come from God must be revoked. You were never meant to live beneath the weight of ancient agreements. You were born to break them. And when fire falls, curses reverse, chains shatter, and the name of Jesus is lifted above every altar that tried to hold you captive. The enemy built the gallows with confidence. Just like Haman, he crafted the trap, planned the fall, timed the destruction. He thought he was ahead. He thought no one saw him. But what he didn't know was that while he was scheming in darkness, a fire-breathing believer was praying in secret. And fire always rewrites the plot. This believer had been targeted. The attacks were calculated. Delays, slander, sabotage. The enemy used people close to him, moments meant for elevation, and seasons designed for breakthrough to try and destroy him. It was spiritual warfare wrapped in natural events, but the believer refused to panic. He didn't retaliate in the flesh. He went into the spirit, into prayer, into fire. Lord, every pit dug for me, let the digger fall into it, every snare set for my downfall. Let it catch the feet of the one who laid it. Let every tongue that rises against me be condemned. Let fire answer every plan of darkness. And heaven responded, because fire prayer doesn't just stop the attack, it turns it around. It sends confusion into the camp of the enemy. What was formed to destroy begins to backfire. The setup becomes the stage for elevation. The false accusation becomes the reason for promotion. The betrayal becomes the catalyst for destiny. Just like Mordecai, the one marked for death becomes the one the king honors, and the very gallows the enemy raised, he hangs on them himself. That's what happens when you pray with fire. The enemy can't stop the hand of God. When you stay in the Spirit and refuse to fight carnally, divine reversal becomes your portion. The arrow shot at you turn midair. The curses reverse direction. The net breaks, but not under you, under the one who threw it. It happened suddenly. The believer saw tables turn. Those who mocked him started to watch him rise. Those who lied began to be exposed. Every delay broke. Every closed door opened, and not because he manipulated the situation, but because he released fire into it. Because fire prayer isn't just defense, it's divine offense. The enemy never expected it. He thought he'd win by silence, by fear, by subtle attacks, but fire flipped the script. What was meant for evil became a setup for glory. And the believer didn't just survive, he came out shining. He came out promoted. He came out walking in favor that only God could have written into the story. Never underestimate what God can do with a trap, because the same hole they dig for you will become the grave of their plans. The same rope they tie will bind their own hands. Fire prayer causes divine reversals, and when you stay in the fire, you'll always come out refined, while the enemy falls into the very destruction he designed for you. He used to be timid, quiet, careful not to stir the waters, afraid to pray too boldly, to speak too loudly, to confront too directly. But fire changes everything. You cannot carry the fire of God and remain the same. You cannot be ignited and still live like you're powerless. The same man who once whispered prayers in fear now walks like a furnace. Something inside him caught fire and it never went out. Fire prayer didn't just change his circumstances, it changed him, it refined him, purified him, burned away fear, and revealed boldness. He didn't just pray with fire, he became fire. Everywhere he walked, atmosphere shifted. Demons didn't just notice him, they fled from him. Curses couldn't land, arrows couldn't stick. He became too hot to handle, because when God sets a man ablaze, hell backs off. The enemy tried to come again. Same old tactics, same old whispers, but they no longer worked. The fire had built a wall, not just around him, but within him. He didn't need to start a prayer to release fire. He carried it. He was a walking altar, a living flame, the kind of believer who doesn't just pray for revival, he is revival. When he walks into a room, the hidden spirits stir, not because of volume, but because of presence. Holy presence, fire presence. He no longer begged God for protection. He understood now. He was the weapon. He didn't run from the enemy. The enemy ran from him. He didn't shrink back from spiritual warfare. He lived in it, conquered in it, triumphed through it. Because fire carriers don't just survive, they reign. They walk through storms without smoke. They tread on serpents without flinching. Because what once scared them now fears them. He began to live differently, no longer reacting. He moved in revelation, no longer asking for permission. He walked in authority. Fire carriers don't wait for permission to burn. They ignite wherever they are. They preach with fire, worship with fire, pray with fire. And when they speak, it's not mere words, it's spirit and flame. The world tried to explain it. He's different now. He's intense. He prays like a warrior. But what they didn't know was that this fire was not emotional hype. It was survival. It was transformation. It was the power of God dwelling in a yielded vessel. And once you taste that fire, you refuse to go back to anything less. He was no longer just a believer. He was a burning one, uncursable, unstoppable, unshakable. Because when you carry fire, your name is not just known on earth, it is known in hell. The same way demons said, Jesus I know and Paul I know, they now say, and him we fear. Fire prayer made him a flame. Fire living made him a threat. And everywhere he goes, darkness must retreat. Because when you become fire, there's no room for fear, only dominion. The plans were real, the traps were set, the curses were spoken, but none of them stood, none of them lasted, because the fire was greater. What the enemy meant for destruction became the fuel for elevation. The believer didn't just survive the warfare, he fulfilled his destiny through it, and now he walks, not in fear, but in fire. He looks back and sees the scars, the battles, the moments he almost gave up, but he also sees the altars that burned, the chains that snapped, the mountains that moved. Every plan the enemy launched had one thing in common. They failed, not because he was strong, but because the fire of God went before him. Every curse broke, every demonic trap collapsed, every witchcraft plot reversed. Because when your destiny is wrapped in fire, no darkness can consume it. He no longer worries about who's plotting. He no longer loses sleep over spiritual attacks, because he knows now you don't have to fear what fire can destroy. His destiny was not delicate, it was fireproof. formed in the mind of God, sealed by the blood and guarded by the flame. What God ordains, hell cannot override, and what God ignites, no man can extinguish. There are still enemies, still storms, still schemes, but he walks through them untouched. Like the Hebrew boys in the furnace, the fire around him only reveals the God within him. The flames that were meant to finish him became the proof that he was chosen. He doesn't just carry purpose, he carries proof. The enemy tried and failed. Destiny isn't a smooth road, it's a battlefield. But for those who carry fire, every battle is a doorway. Every attack is a platform. Every delay is a setup for divine acceleration. He stopped asking, "Why me?" and started declaring, "Use me." Because now he knows those with fire are called to walk paths others fear to tread. And he's ready because he's fireproof, not perfect, but preserved, not exempt from attack, but immune to defeat, because every plan formed in darkness must bow to the fire of God. It doesn't matter how old the curse is, doesn't matter how long the altar has stood. When fire shows up, history breaks, hell retreats, and destiny unfolds. He is not afraid of tomorrow, not afraid of warfare, not afraid of demons or delays, because he walks in something stronger. Fire isn't just behind him, it's within him. He's not waiting to see if the enemy will attack. He already knows the outcome. No weapon formed shall prosper. Every tongue shall be condemned. Every altar shall be consumed. Every evil plan shall fall. This is the victory of the fire carrier. Not just that he overcame, but that he was transformed, molded in prayer, forged in warfare, and sealed by the flame. His destiny is fireproof, and every evil plan, no matter how loud, will always burn before the presence of God. Always. There is a prayer the devil dreads more than any other. It is not long, it is not loud, it doesn't require a microphone or a platform, but when it is spoken from the depths of a surrendered heart, all of hell begins to tremble. That prayer is this: Lord, not my will, but yours be done. It was prayed in the darkest hour of history in a garden called Gethsemane, as the weight of sin pressed down on Jesus, as the cross loomed ahead, as the flesh cried out for another way. This was the moment the enemy thought he had won. But instead, Jesus fell on his face and said the words that broke every strategy of darkness: "Not my will, but yours be done." That prayer didn't just prepare him for Calvary, it shattered Satan's grip before the nails even touched his hands. You see, hell thrives where self reigns. The devil works through pride, through ego, through independence. As long as you live for yourself, he has leverage. As long as you chase your own desires, he has access. But the moment you lay down your will, you cut off his influence. The moment you surrender control, you invite heaven's authority. This is why that prayer is so powerful. It is the death of self and the birth of obedience. It's where your plans end and God's purpose begins. It's not a prayer of weakness, it's a declaration of war. Because nothing frustrates hell more than a believer who refuses to be controlled by their own flesh. The devil doesn't fear church attendance. He doesn't mind religious activity, but when he hears a child of God whisper through tears, "Not my will, but yours be done," he knows he's lost the battle. That prayer removes your name from the throne and puts Jesus in his rightful place. That prayer says, "God, I trust you even when I don't understand you. I'll obey even when it costs me everything." It's not glamorous, it's not popular, but it's where power is born, because heaven doesn't back talent, it backs surrender. Heaven doesn't move because of ambition, it moves because of submission. That's why Jesus didn't say, "Let my gift speak." He said, "Let your will be done." And that same prayer is still available to you today. When you pray it, chains break. When you pray it, fear loses its grip. When you pray it, the devil backs off because he knows he can't manipulate a surrendered vessel. Hell fears nothing more than a yielded life. So if you want to confuse the enemy, stop arguing, stop striving, stop trying to control everything, and simply say what Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours be done." That prayer didn't just change history, it's still breaking strongholds today. Try it and watch what happens. Surrender doesn't look like victory in the eyes of the world. It looks like giving up. It looks like weakness. But in the kingdom of God, surrender is not defeat. It is the highest form of warfare. It is not the end of power. It is the birthplace of it. Because when a believer lifts their hands and says, "Lord, I let go," all of heaven leans in and all of hell loses its grip. We live in a culture obsessed with control. Control your image, control your future, control your outcomes. But that's not kingdom living. That's bondage disguised as independence. The more you try to control everything, the more exhausted you become, because control isn't freedom. It's a trap. It's the enemy's way of keeping you busy with your own strength while cutting you off from God's power. But surrender flips the script. It says, "God, I don't want my plan if it's not your plan. I don't want to win if it means losing your will." And the moment you pray that, chains begin to break. Not because you fought harder, but because you stopped fighting against God. The devil hates surrender because it takes away his leverage. His access point is pride. He feeds on ego. He thrives in environments where people insist on doing it their way. That's what got him cast out of heaven. I will ascend. I will be like the Most High. The moment you echo heaven instead and say, "Not my will, but yours be done," you sever every agreement you ever made with pride, and pride is what fuels Satan's kingdom. The surrendered believer is dangerous because they can't be bought, bribed, or broken. They don't need to be in control because they trust the one who is. They don't panic when plans change because their life isn't built on their own design. It's anchored in God's purpose. The devil loses every time a believer chooses surrender over striving. Jesus didn't conquer death by force. He conquered it by surrender. He didn't crush Satan with armies. He crushed him with obedience. On that cross, he didn't resist the nails. He yielded. And in that moment, the devil lost the keys to death, hell, and the grave. Because what Satan saw as weakness was actually the doorway to all power. Surrender is not giving up. It's giving God the room to move. It's saying, "I choose obedience over outcome. I choose faith over formula. I choose purpose over pride." And when you make that choice, heaven backs you and hell fears you. The strongest prayer you will ever pray isn't, "God bless my will." It's, "God, replace it," because that's when you stop trying to win the fight and start walking in victory, the kind of victory that only comes through surrender. The real battleground is not your habits, your hands, or your behavior, it's your will. That's what the enemy's after, not just what you do, but what you want. Because if Satan can bend your will, he doesn't need to fight your actions. He knows that your hands will follow your heart and your feet will follow your desire, so the war is always for your will. From the very beginning, this has been the strategy. In the Garden of Eden, Satan didn't force Adam and Eve to sin. He twisted their desire. He appealed to their will. He said, "Don't you want to be like God?" And the moment they chose their own way over God's, the door to death swung open. It wasn't the bite that cursed the world. It was the decision behind it. Rebellion begins, not with the hands, but with the heart that says, "My will be done." That's why spiritual warfare is not fought by screaming louder or swinging harder. It is fought by surrendering deeper. The devil is not intimidated by a loud Christian who still lives on their own terms. But when a believer bows and says, "God, I want your way even when mine feels easier," the enemy knows he's dealing with someone he can't control. "Not my will" is not just a phrase, it is a sword. It cuts off pride. It breaks the grip of self. It dethrones the idol of independence and sets Christ in his rightful place. The devil loses jurisdiction the moment you say, I give up my rights so that you can reign. And that's what makes this battle so intense, because the enemy doesn't want your worship. He wants your will. He wants you to worship on Sunday, but live by your own desires Monday through Saturday. He knows he doesn't need to pull you out of church if he can keep you out of surrender. As long as you say, God, bless my plans, instead of God, replace my plans, he still has influence. But the moment you pray what Jesus prayed, not my will, but yours be done, you win the war. Not because your situation changes, but because your position does. You shift from self-lordship to Christ-lordship. And once Jesus is Lord over your will, the enemy no longer has a seat at your table. This is why the greatest threat to hell is not a perfect Christian. It's a surrendered one, the one who no longer negotiates with God, the one who has decided that obedience is not optional, the one who doesn't just quote Scripture but actually bows to its author. That is the heart the devil cannot manipulate. That is the life heaven can use. So if you feel like you're in a war, don't just fight harder. Submit deeper, because in the kingdom, the real victory begins when you say, not my will. There are families bound by patterns that no one talks about, cycles that repeat from one generation to the next: anger, addiction, divorce, poverty, shame. It looks normal because it's all they've ever known, but what they don't see is that behind the dysfunction is a spiritual inheritance. A generational curse wrapped in behavior, masked by culture, but fueled by rebellion. And it continues until someone stands up and prays a prayer that changes everything. Your will be done. This prayer is not passive. It is not polite. It is war. Because when you say your will be done, you are tearing up contracts that were signed by ancestors who said yes to sin. You are canceling demonic agreements made in ignorance, idolatry, or pain. You're drawing a line in the sand and saying, it ends with me. Generational curses don't break because you go to church. They break when someone finally surrenders their life, not to religion, but to the will of God. That one act of submission holds more power than years of striving, because the devil cannot hold what has been yielded to Jesus. When God's will enters the room, every demonic assignment has to exit. When the name of Jesus is enthroned over a bloodline, every chain begins to shake. The enemy wants you to believe that this is just your personality, just your struggle, just your normal. But it's not. It's spiritual, and it doesn't need management. It needs to be broken. You don't need therapy for a curse. You need the authority of the kingdom, and authority is released when surrender is real. Satan depends on generational rebellion to keep families in bondage. He counts on sons walking in the same pride as their fathers, daughters carrying the same wounds as their mothers. He doesn't even have to be creative, just consistent. But when one child of God finally says, no more, the bloodline shifts. When one voice says, Father, not my will, but yours, heaven responds and hell recoils. God's will is not weak. It doesn't negotiate with curses. It doesn't blend with demonic inheritance. It replaces it. It uproots everything hell has planted and plants something eternal. God's will overrides trauma. God's will rewrites history. God's will doesn't just bless you. It liberates generations after you. That's why the devil hates surrender, because it doesn't just change your life, it changes the legacy. When you bow in prayer and declare, your will be done, you're not just praying for today. You're breaking something ancient, something that's been allowed to live in your family line for far too long, but no more. This is the prayer that makes demons tremble. It is the moment when heaven steps in and hell backs down. It is the sound of curses being crushed under the weight of divine authority. So pray it with faith. Pray it with fire, because when you say, your will be done, every generational curse begins to break. Hell doesn't panic when you go to church. It doesn't flinch when you post scriptures online. But the moment your heart aligns with God's purpose, all of hell takes notice, because alignment is dangerous. It means you're no longer walking in circles. You found your assignment. You've silenced your flesh. You've said yes to the thing heaven created you to do, and demons tremble at that kind of surrender. Alignment is not about perfection. It's about posture. It's the moment you stop negotiating with God and start obeying Him without delay. When you pray, "Your will be done," and mean it, heaven moves, and so does hell, because the enemy knows what happens when a child of God steps into purpose. Chains break, lives are changed, and strongholds collapse. You stop living for applause and you start living for impact. You stop chasing survival and you start walking in dominion. That's why Satan fights the hardest when you're closest to surrender. The greatest warfare isn't when you're in rebellion, it's when you're on the edge of obedience. That's when the lies get louder. That's when fear starts screaming. That's when every insecurity shows up and every door seems to close. Not because God is absent, but because the enemy knows he's about to lose access. You see, Satan thrives in misalignment. As long as you're out of sync with heaven, he's comfortable. You can still be talented, gifted, influential, but if your heart isn't aligned, you're not a threat. Hell doesn't fear potential, it fears purpose. And the moment your will submits to God's will, the enemy loses legal ground. Alignment is where power begins. It's where the anointing flows. It's the place where heaven partners with earth, where angels are dispatched and miracles are birthed. God doesn't back rebellion, He backs surrender. And when your heart, your mind, and your life come into agreement with His plan, divine backup arrives. Not because you shouted louder, but because you positioned yourself under His authority. This is why the enemy tries to wear you down before you step in. He'll attack your mind. He'll stir up confusion. He'll use distractions, delays, even good opportunities to detour you from the God assignment. But the secret is this: if hell is fighting you, you're likely getting close. If the pressure is increasing, the purpose is near. Don't back down, press in, because when you align, something shifts. Heaven takes over, grace flows, power is released, and everything the enemy tried to delay suddenly accelerates. When you say, "Lord, not my will, but yours," you don't just make a declaration. You activate divine momentum. You become a living threat to darkness. Hell reacts to alignment because it knows what heaven will do through a surrendered vessel. So don't fear the attack. Recognize it as confirmation. The enemy fights what he fears, and he fears the moment you finally say yes. Every believer has a Gethsemane. It may not look like olive trees and a moonlit sky, but it's real. It's that hidden place where your will and God's will collide. It's the moment you realize the cost of obedience, the moment your flesh screams for comfort, but your spirit aches for purpose, and what you decide in that moment will shape your destiny. Jesus faced his garden test alone. The disciples were nearby, but they were sleeping. Heaven was silent, the weight was crushing, and yet in that moment of agony, he prayed the most powerful words ever spoken: "Not my will, but yours be done." It was not an easy prayer, it was a bloody one. Sweat became like drops of blood. His soul was overwhelmed, but still, he surrendered, and with that prayer, he crushed the serpent's head before the cross, ever pierced his hands. You will have your own Gethsemane. Maybe you're in it right now, that place where God asks for something you want to keep. That place where he leads you away from the crowd, away from the comfort, and asks you to trust him without answers. That place where your calling feels heavier than your capacity. And this is where the enemy comes in, not with horns, but with comfort, not with force, but with options. Satan's most strategic attacks happen in the garden. He whispers, "There's an easier way. Do it later. Protect yourself. Stay safe." He wants you to delay surrender until the moment passes, because he knows your greatest breakthrough is on the other side of your yes. He knows purpose is unlocked the moment you bow your will. So he tempts you not with obvious sin, but with the temptation to settle. Settle for what's familiar. Settle for what's safe. Settle for what won't cost as much. But if you run from the garden, you miss the glory. If you cling to comfort, you abort your calling. The anointing doesn't rest on convenience. It rests on obedience. Gethsemane is where God tests your willingness to be used. It's where he looks not at your talent, but at your surrender. It's where your yes becomes your weapon. You can't skip the garden. It's where oil is pressed, where self is crushed, where pride dies. The power of the resurrection came after the surrender in Gethsemane, and the same is true for you. The devil fears a believer who stays in the garden long enough to say yes, not a casual yes, but a costly one, the kind that hurts, the kind that breaks you, the kind that empties you just enough for God to fill you with something greater. So when the garden comes, don't run, don't resist, don't negotiate. Pass the test, because everything God promised you on the mountain is waiting for your surrender in the garden. And once you say, "Not my will, but yours," the enemy has nothing left to use against you. Obedience is easy when it's convenient, when it fits your plans, when it doesn't cost much. But the true test of obedience comes when saying, "Yes, Lord," means letting go of everything you thought you needed. It's when God asks for the very thing you were hoping to keep. And that's when most people hesitate, not because they don't love God, but because they fear the cost. But let me tell you something the devil hopes you never realize. He can't control a believer who obeys through pain. He loses power over someone who says yes while tears are still falling. He panics when you follow God, even when it breaks your heart, because that kind of obedience isn't rooted in comfort. It's rooted in trust. And trust is something hell can't counterfeit. Look at Abraham. God didn't ask him for leftovers. He asked for Isaac, the promise, the miracle, the son he waited years to receive, and still Abraham said yes. He walked up the mountain with wood in one hand and obedience in the other. He didn't know the outcome, but he trusted the one who gave the command. And on that mountain, the test became a testimony. The sacrifice became a setup for supernatural provision. The cost of obedience will stretch you. It will offend your logic. It will confront your fears. But every yes spoken in the face of fear breaks the enemy's grip. Fear thrives where obedience is delayed. But the moment you surrender, even with trembling hands, the chains fall. Because obedience is not about the size of your sacrifice. It's about the posture of your heart. The enemy knows that delayed obedience is still disobedience. That's why he doesn't need to stop you. He just needs to slow you down, get you second-guessing, get you questioning, get you so focused on what you might lose that you forget what God wants to give. But the truth is, anything you lay down for God becomes seed. And what is sown in tears is always reaped in power. When Jesus said yes in Gethsemane, it cost him everything. His friends left him. His body was broken. His blood was poured out. But through that yes came resurrection, redemption, and eternal victory. That's the pattern. First the yes, then the breakthrough. First the pain, then the power. So if God is asking for something that feels costly, don't let fear speak louder than your faith. The reward for obedience is always greater than the weight of the sacrifice. And on the other side of your yes is a life you couldn't build on your own, a door you couldn't open with your own hands, a move of God that only surrender can unlock. The devil fears your yes because it's the sound of a heart that trusts God more than comfort, more than clarity, more than control. And once you say yes, even when it costs everything, there's not a demon in hell that can stop what God is about to do through you. When you say the words, "Your will be done," something begins to shift far beyond what your eyes can see. It may sound quiet in the natural, but in the spirit, it's an earthquake. Atmospheres tremble, chains snap, and heaven starts to move. Because that prayer isn't just communication, it's activation. It opens the floodgates of divine authority. It signals to the spirit realm that a vessel has surrendered. And when heaven finds a vessel, it sends help. Angels don't respond to emotion, they respond to alignment. When a life bows in full submission to God's will, angelic reinforcements are released, not because you shouted, but because you yielded, not because you were loud, but because you were in position. There's a divine order to things, and when your heart lines up with heaven, the power of God flows without resistance. The enemy hopes you think your prayer is small. He hopes you assume your surrender is unnoticed. But the moment you say, "Not my will but yours," you disrupt his strategies, you confuse his ranks, you cancel every assignment that was banking on your disobedience. Demons that were sent to distract, delay, or destroy suddenly lose their grip, because authority has shifted in the spirit. You see, hell is not threatened by your talent. It's not afraid of your following, but it is terrified of your obedience, because your surrender creates shockwaves. It shifts the environment of your home. It breaks generational patterns. It opens doors in the supernatural that no man could open in the natural. When you say yes to God's will, you align yourself with eternal purpose, and eternity begins to back you. Spiritual authority doesn't come from charisma, it comes from crucifixion. When your flesh dies, your spirit rises. When your will bows, your influence expands. And when your desires decrease, God's power increases. That's the paradox of surrender. It looks like laying down, but in the kingdom, that's how you rise up. This is why the devil fights your prayer life. He knows the moment you stop praying for your own will and start praying for God's, he's lost control. Because now you're not just reacting to life, you're commanding the atmosphere. You're not just living from the outside in, you're moving from the inside out with heaven's power flowing through you. The greatest revivals don't begin in crowds, they begin in surrendered hearts. One person on their knees whispering, "Your will be done," can shift the atmosphere of a city. That's the kind of obedience heaven celebrates. That's the kind of prayer that dispatches angels, dismantles strongholds, and sets the stage for miracles. So don't underestimate the power of surrender. Your quiet yes is louder in the spirit than 1,000 empty declarations. When you align with God's will, you don't just change your future, you change the spiritual landscape around you. And hell has no strategy for a believer who's fully surrendered to the will of the King. Hell doesn't fear titles. It doesn't shake at charisma. It doesn't back down because someone has a platform or a following. But when one person becomes fully yielded, when they pray without agenda, obey without delay, and move the moment God speaks, hell begins to panic. Because that kind of believer cannot be stopped. That kind of believer is dangerous. The devil's greatest fear is not a loud Christian. It's not a famous preacher. It's the one who's invisible to the crowd but visible to heaven, the one who has died to their own plans and is fully alive to God's. You can't bribe them with money, you can't intimidate them with loss, and you can't distract them with noise. Why? Because they've already said yes. Yes before the assignment. Yes before the answer. Yes before the cost. A fully yielded believer is not living for comfort. They're living for obedience. They don't need applause. They need presence. They don't ask, will this benefit me? They ask, did God speak? They're not driven by open doors. They're led by divine direction. And that terrifies the enemy because that kind of surrender carries weight. not just in the natural, but in the spirit. You see, the devil thrives on compromise. He works through hesitation. If he can't get you to turn back, he'll try to slow you down. He'll whisper half-truths. He'll offer easier options. But when a believer is fully yielded, those whispers fall flat. Because surrender silences temptation. It shuts down the debate. It removes the option of disobedience. Look at Jesus. He was fully yielded. He didn't wait for conditions to be favorable. He didn't demand proof. He didn't seek validation. He just obeyed. From the garden to the cross, he said yes to the Father, and that yes broke the back of darkness, that yes destroyed the grip of sin, that yes echoed through eternity, and still sets captives free today. The same power rests on those who follow that same posture. When you say, "Your will, not mine," and mean it, you step into kingdom authority. Not because you're strong, but because you're surrendered. Not because you have influence, but because you've emptied yourself of control. And God fills empty vessels. The devil has no weapon against a yielded life. He can't manipulate it. He can't coerce it. He can't scare it into silence, because that kind of believer doesn't fear loss. They fear disobedience. They've already counted the cost. They've already laid down their rights, and they've already won before the battle even begins. So if you want to become a threat to the kingdom of darkness, don't just get louder, get lower, get surrendered, get yielded. Because when you belong fully to God, hell has nothing left to hold on to. That kind of life shakes atmospheres, dismantles strongholds, and walks in power the enemy can't explain. And that's why your surrender makes you dangerous. Some are fasting, some are crying, some are pleading with God for breakthrough, but heaven is not waiting on more effort, it's waiting on surrender, because the thing blocking your next season isn't always the devil. Sometimes it's your grip, sometimes it's your plans, and until you say, "Your will be done," you'll remain stuck in cycles you were meant to break out of long ago. Destiny doesn't respond to striving, it responds to surrender. You can strategize, network, study, and plan, but none of that opens the doors only God can open. It's not wrong to prepare, but when preparation becomes your source instead of His presence, you're building on sand. Because one act of obedience can do more in a moment than years of human effort. One yielded yes can accelerate what you've been waiting on for decades. Look at Mary, a teenage girl with no status, no credentials, no platform, and yet she became the mother of the Messiah, not because she was the most qualified, but because she was the most surrendered. "Be it unto me according to your word." That one sentence positioned her to carry heaven's plan. Destiny didn't find her in ambition, it found her in agreement. You don't need to force doors open when you're surrendered. You don't need to chase opportunities when you're aligned. Surrender positions you where favor flows. And the thing you've been praying for may be standing behind the door called yes. Not a half-hearted yes, not a conditional yes, a full, total, all-in yes that says, "God, if it costs me everything, I still want your will more than mine." That's where acceleration happens. In the moment pride dies, in the moment control is released, in the moment you stop trying to build your own name and start lifting His, that's when God begins to move in ways you couldn't imagine. Because He doesn't bless rebellion and He doesn't promote ambition. He rewards surrender. Some are asking, "God, when will it happen?" But heaven is asking, "When will you let go?" You've been praying for doors, but God's been waiting for your will, because what you refuse to surrender, you'll have to sustain on your own. But what you place in His hands, He multiplies. Jesus didn't step into resurrection until He said yes in Gethsemane. That's the pattern. Surrender always precedes power. And if you're tired of waiting, maybe it's time to stop striving and start surrendering. Destiny is not delayed because God is slow. It's often delayed because we're still holding the pen, trying to write our own story. But when you finally say, "Your will be done," you hand God the pen. You give Him permission to write a script that's bigger than your dreams and better than your plan. And what He writes is not only holy, it's unstoppable, because surrender doesn't just unlock breakthrough, it unlocks destiny. Gethsemane was not the end of Jesus, it was the beginning of victory. He didn't just pray there, He didn't just sweat blood there, He won there, because before He ever faced Pilate, before He ever carried the cross, before He ever said, "It is finished," He first said, "Not my will, but yours be done." That prayer was the turning point. That surrender was the key, and what followed was not defeat, it was resurrection power. We often talk about the empty tomb, but we forget the garden. We celebrate the victory, but we overlook the surrender that made it possible. Resurrection didn't begin at the stone being rolled away. It began when Jesus knelt down and laid His will aside, because true power is not found in striving. It's found in yielding. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is available to those who choose to live the same way He died, in full surrender. If you want to walk in power, you must first learn to kneel in obedience. The enemy doesn't fear the one who knows how to talk about authority. He fears the one who knows how to submit to it. Because real authority doesn't come from volume, it comes from submission. The one who bows the lowest is the one who walks with heaven's highest backing. You can't carry resurrection power while clinging to your own will. The cross was heavy, but Jesus didn't carry it bitterly. He carried it willingly. And when He got up on that third day, He didn't just rise for Himself. He rose for every surrendered soul who would follow in His footsteps. That same Spirit that rolled away the stone now lives in the life that says yes. There is a kind of power that doesn't come from gifting. It doesn't come from charisma. It comes from crucifixion. Paul said, "I die daily." Why? Because he understood that resurrection power only flows through a surrendered vessel. You can't resurrect what hasn't died. You can't live in supernatural authority while protecting your own agenda. The problem is not that we aren't praying, it's that we're praying without surrender. But when your prayer shifts from bless me to break me, from use me to empty me, power follows, because God will always fill what is first poured out. Heaven responds to surrender, not performance. So if you want to see resurrection in your life, resurrection in your purpose, in your calling, in your family, don't just ask for power. Pray like Jesus prayed. Lay it all down. Say, "Not my will." Let that prayer bury your pride, silence your fear, and crucify your flesh. Because once surrender is real, resurrection is inevitable. That's the pattern. That's the process. First the garden, then the grave, then the glory. And if you're willing to bow low, heaven will raise you up in power no man can take away. There's a prayer that can change everything. It doesn't require a pulpit, a crowd, or a perfect past. You don't need the right words or the right atmosphere. All you need is a heart that's ready to let go. Because when you finally say, "Lord, not my will, but yours be done," you step into the very thing the devil's been trying to keep you from your whole life: freedom, purpose, and power. This isn't just a nice prayer. It's a declaration, a weapon, a shift. It's the moment heaven leans in and hell backs off, because hell can't chain what heaven has claimed. And the moment you stop running and start surrendering, something supernatural begins to break open. Fear starts to lose its grip. Delay begins to die. The false identity you've worn for years starts to fall off, and the real you, the one heaven designed, starts to rise. Satan fears this moment, not because you're loud, but because you're ready. Ready to stop pretending, ready to stop performing, ready to stop living life on your terms and start living it on God's. You've tried control and it failed. You've chased your own plans and ended up empty. You've held on, and all it's done is exhaust you. Now is the time. Now is the moment. Pray it today, not tomorrow. Not when you feel more spiritual, not after you get everything together. Today, because the breakthrough you've been waiting for isn't delayed. It's just waiting for your surrender. That job won't fulfill you. That relationship can't complete you. That money won't secure you. But one prayer can rewire your entire life. One moment of real surrender can shift everything. This is the prayer that silences the noise, clears the fog, and realigns your soul. Not my will, not my plan, not my way. Yours, God. Yours fully, yours completely, yours without conditions, because I'm done running. I'm done negotiating. I want you more than I want comfort. I want purpose more than I want control. And when you pray that, don't be surprised when peace rushes in. Don't be surprised when old chains fall and new doors open. Don't be surprised when you start walking different, thinking different, living different, because the moment you lay down your will, you pick up heaven's assignment and nothing can stop it. So pray it today. Say it with trembling lips if you have to. Whisper it through tears. Shout it in faith. But whatever you do, don't wait. This is your moment, your Gethsemane, your line in the sand. Hell hopes you'll hesitate. Heaven is waiting for your yes. And when you give it, everything changes. Not my will, but yours be done. Say it, mean it, and never be the same.